Welcome to this beginner figure drawing course. This is a series of lessons that are designed to get you started with the often challenging world of drawing and painting the human figure. In this series of lessons, you're going to start with the very basic ideas around the human figure and gradually work your way up to more and more advanced tools and concepts. In this series of lessons, we'll learn all there is to know about gesture, we'll take a deep dive into construction, we'll learn how to make our poses look really dynamic and fluid, and along the way we're going to cover each area of the body in specific detail. Everything from the head all the way down to the toes. We're going to look at all the different shapes and forms they make, how they articulate, and how they connect with each other. Once we've covered the whole figure, we'll start to move on to more advanced concepts that include clothing and drapery, composing the figure from imagination, and drawing facial expressions. In total, there's almost 24 hours worth of lectures, demonstrations, and exercises for you to watch and draw along with at your own pace. All of this is available via the Gumroad link in the description. If you're not 100% sure about whether this is something for you, here's a little sample of the entire course to check out. Let's take a look at what's on offer. As I mentioned earlier, this initial gesture is going to eventually be covered up. So it's important that whatever we build on top of it follows this line work. Notice how I'm connecting this egg-shaped form to the gesture line. We want to follow that idea through to the other areas. Have our muscles connecting to that line underneath to follow the movement. Even if it isn't true in real life, we want it to be true in our art. So I've got my bean-shaped foundations in place. Now I'll start to just define the ribcage and pelvis area positions a little better. Our ribcage is positioned a lot closer towards us whilst her hips are moving away from us. So we've got a really nice, twisty, dynamic pose here. If the figure is standing at attention with its legs close together, we can actually start our gesture line as high as the top of the hips. It's really only when the legs start to bend that we need to place that initial gesture line at the midway point of the pelvis. And as I said, that placement can be anywhere between 1/3 and the halfway point. If you look at the pose that I'm drawing, you can see that I've exaggerated things a lot more, and it ends up looking far more interesting than what the reference image does. So that's a better error to make. You're better off making things look far more dynamic, far more fluid, far more heroic than what it would look if we were to make things look smaller. And if we push it too far, we simply just scale things back a little bit then. So we can make our proportions a little bit smaller. We can add some corners to our gesture lines to help stiffen it up a little bit. If we look at the skull and break it down, we'll see that it merges into the facial structure. So we're going to have to work out some transitional areas to help with that. We've got the brow ridge area, the eye sockets, cheekbones, mouth, and chin, all these additional structures that we have to develop. What we'll see here is that the corners of our jaw normally sit higher than the corners of the chin. But what happens when we start to tilt the head up is the corners of the jaw will actually start to sit lower than the chin. So all we have to do is figure out where our chin sits and then move those jawline corners up or down accordingly. The more the head tilts backwards, the further below those jaw corners are going to be in relation to the chin. We're going to see a series of stepping movements over the whole eye structure. Down from the brow to the top of the eyelid, down from the top of the lid and stepping back onto the cornea, curving down that cornea and stepping back out onto the top of that bottom lid, and then curving down and merging into the face. If we go across the planes of this area with our cross contour lines, we'll curve down from that ball onto the top of that cup-shaped wing, and then curve down from that structure into the plane of the face. Now, the first image we have here really only has one long gesture curve for us to work with. All our parts are roughly moving in the same direction. Our second image has at least two main gesture curves because our forearm is going in one direction and the hand is going in another. But we've actually got a third gesture line here too, and that's the direction the fingers are making together. It's far easier to think of our fingers as one large shape that we divide later up into separate parts and gestures than it is to do them individually first. There are going to be two main things we have to contend with when it comes to hair. The first is supporting structures that the hair is in contact with. More often than not, that will be in reference to the head, but it could also be any area of the body that supports hair. And the second, of course, is going to be gravity, which is always going to be naturally pulling the head downwards. The goal up until this point has been about capturing the essence of a pose, capturing its rough foundations. When it comes to light and shadow, however, we are going to be beholden to the laws of nature. No matter how free we are initially, no matter how loose we are with our construction at that stage, when we start adding in our light and shadow, we have no choice but to be beholden to the laws of nature. The other thing that is going to be of help for us is using landmarks on the torso. When we start twisting and turning the torso, we can start to easily lose control over where specific details of the torso should be placed. So we've got a series of features on the back and front of the torso that not only act as identifiers for our major muscle and bone areas, but are going to double as positioning markers for when we start moving the torso around. So even though the ankles aren't really part of the foot, for the purpose of our lesson, we'll consider it as part of the overall foot structure. The ankles are the pivot point for our feet and will allow the foot to rock back and forth freely, as well as a little bit from side to side also. It doesn't have nearly the range of motion as our hand does with the wrist, because the ankles act a little bit more like a vice gripping onto the foot, whilst the hand and wrist act more like a ball joint. This is our shoulder line. It's our natural corner line for our arms. Where these two bony protrusions meet is exactly where the middle of the arms begin. In fact, these two areas are important landmarks because they act as a corner for the torso as well. If we have a look at things from above, we can see how these two areas meeting together create not only this corner landmark for the torso, but also act as the connection point for where our arms are positioned. What many beginner artists tend to do is we stick the legs right on the edge of this pelvis. This is not only structurally incorrect, it ends up making our figures look very flat. Instead, our construction work here needs to begin a little way in from the edge. We have to remember that the legs are overlapping the pelvis from this perspective. And as we said earlier, the pelvis tilts forward. So we need to make sure our tilted pelvis is showing through from the profile view. When both of these vertical and horizontal forces intersect, what we start seeing are the type of compression folds we are used to seeing. What ends up being created by these intersecting forces are folds that have a distinct Z-shaped pattern, a series of cylinder shapes zigzagging their way down the drapery. We can also look at these peaks as being X shapes, or if we want to look at the negative space where the valleys are being created, diamond shapes. We can see here now, with just a little bit of extra development, we've created a much more interesting journey for our gesture than what we originally had. Initially, we started with one big C curve. Now we've taken a real roller coaster ride. Back in lesson 1, we talked about how gesture is the implied movement, or the relationship our body parts make together. We started with this. Now we've managed to do this. Wow, what an amazing evolution this is. We've taken those weaknesses that our construction was causing on our gesture side and have now turned it into a strength. Now, because the mouth is pretty relaxed here, we're not going to get those inward movements that we saw in the last demonstration. What can get tricky with the mouth is when it starts to open, is that top lip, as it approaches the corner of the mouth, can start to look as if it's twisting under. Think of this as being a bit like a piece of fabric or a strip of paper that's getting twisted. So just be mindful of what's happening with that top lip, as it can start to look as if it's twisting and overlapping itself depending on the position and the expression. So that's a sample of what's on offer. If you've always wanted to give figure drawing a shot but have never been quite sure where to start, then this is going to be the course for you. So check out the Gumroad link below and get started today. Let's get drawing.